So India-US relations are in a bit of a flux. There's uncertainty regarding how Donald Trump looks at India. There are issues over trade, over the Indo Pacific, on the Quad. So where exactly do India-US ties actually stand today? I have with me Mr. Richard Rossow, an India specialist at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Rosso, my first question to you: where exactly do India-US ties stand, the way you see it?
Well, I usually look at two legs of the stool, mostly the two that my program personally focuses on, the security relationship and the economic relationship. The two are going in very different directions right now. The economic relationship, at least between our two national capitals, has soured quite a bit over the last year. You see rising trade tensions, you see trade protectionism on both sides, and that's triggered a really intense dialogue that so far neither side has shown much interest in finding an off ramp. On the other side of the coin, though, you look at the security relationship, things are progressing pretty steadily. A very successful 2+2 meeting 2 months ago in New Delhi, some important new agreements signed in terms of a new Tri-Force annual exercise that our militaries will do, signing the Comcasa communications agreement. So good progress on the security side. So two different answers to the question on the state of ties.
So what do you see are the main obstacles ahead?
Well, I think the main obstacles are particularly on the economic side. I think both of our governments are desperately trying to pull in all manufacturing investment that they possibly can. Both governments are closing the door in terms of allowing imports from the other countries. So there's going to be a natural obstacle, and when you think about the economic approaches of both nations. I think the United States, for the most part, over the last 20, 30 years, has thought that trade, even if we have a trade imbalance with certain partners, is a good development strategy for important partners. But that's not the case anymore. Allowing the United States to have easier import regime than a lot of our partners has triggered a trade imbalance that the Trump administration is trying to tackle. So I think the mindset and the economic front for both is the big obstacle. Everything else we've been able to work around and move through, but the economic mindsets and particularly anti-trade in both fronts, both countries is the big obstacle.
Mr. Trump has made some fairly anti-India comments regarding India's economic and trade policies. Is he likely to take harsher measures?
Well, I think we know what some of the harsher measures are that are hanging overhead. You've got, for instance, one very real thing that's happened, which is these 232 steel tariffs, steel and aluminum. And India actually is a fairly large steel importer to the United States. So India already sees higher customs duties in that area. India was named a currency manipulator, at least on the watch list by the Treasury Department. There could be possible trade sanctions against that, although it looks like Treasury is ready to come off that a bit. The Trump administration has announced they're potentially going to revoke India's trade benefits under a program called the Generalized System of Preferences. This is where the United States offers preferential customs duty rates to developing countries. But India, because of India's anti-trade practices, the Trump administration is threatening to withdraw this GSP program. So I think we know the tools that are on the table that the administration is thinking about using. GSP benefit revocation in particular, I think, is the one that probably the Indian government's most concerned about. A fourth area that I think is worth mentioning, although it's not always brought up in the same set of trade sanctions, is on potential limitations on visa regulations. India, of course, is the largest user of the H-1B technical worker program. And the Trump administration, without going back to Congress, has very limited ability to make dramatic changes to it. But there is one that we know that they're already considering, which is right now, if you have an H-1B visa, your spouse can also work. And that's an executive order issued by President Obama. President Trump is talking very actively about revoking that. So you may see something on the visa front as well.
Do you see that as a major blow to our relationship?
I do. When you think about, of course, with the Indian economy, which still is in dramatic need of deregulation in a lot of areas, and even though it's been a steady process of opening up the market since 1991, there still are big areas that are still a little bit closed. So the United States always has a much longer list of trade concerns. So India moves on one thing. Of course, we've got another issue we're going to bring up in its place. So it feels like a bit of a never-ending story, I think, to probably the Indian government. From India's perspective, there's a relatively narrow list of commercial issues that they bring up with the United States. Visas is certainly part of that. Totalization agreement for Social Security payments, right? There's a relatively small number of issues. So if we actually see backtracking on one of those few issues, it has a much larger impact overall. I don't know that your government's going to go to the wall and would necessarily take a step to sever the relationship because the United States accounts for a dramatic percent of India's total exports around the world, both in terms of goods and services. So the United States is too important of a market, I think, for India to take what would be a fatal step on trade. But that will be a pretty disastrous step, I think, in terms of the overall nature of the relationship if the United States begin to close the door on the things India cares about most.
The two sides are talking. Do you hear anything about any progress made so far?
No, actually, it seems that talks have really taken a turn for the worse in some ways. There was supposed to be a major summit in New Delhi, either at the end of October or early November, when the U.S. Trade Representative was going to visit. And from when the time that your Commerce and Industry Minister, Suresh Prabhu, visited Washington back in the late spring, they began a pretty intense set of negotiations where both sides were putting a lot of things on the table that were the major trade irritants. But here we are 3, 4 months later, and neither side has shown much willingness to start to walk back from that. So I think that there was a bit of hope, I think, during the summertime when the talks were under in a pretty substantive way, but they weren't able to come and break the impasse on any of these key trade issues. On the India side, it's price controls of medical devices, it's market access for agriculture, the ever-hanging issue about difference between our two countries in terms of how we look at a patent regime. So the issues that I know have been on the U.S. list have not moved an inch yet. And on the Indian side, I think India's main hope is that we don't take the big step about revoking GSP benefits. So so far, looks like there's no light at the end of this tunnel.
Yeah. Let's get on to this issue of the waiver that the US has indicated it will give us regarding Iran. Exactly how does this waiver work? Is it time bound? Is it, how does it work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the United States stated goal is for every country to reduce oil imports by Iran to zero. Now, knowing that India made a good faith effort and reduced oil imports to a big extent, the United States was happy and willing to give the waiver for this first round. But coming up early next year, there will be another round, and so every few months we will again review this situation. And I don't know what the exact answer is. Are we going to expect it to be zero the next time that we take a review? Is it going to be another step closer is good enough? Because we saw that earlier under the Iran sanctions regime, where as long as India was taking steady steps on reducing oil imports, we gave waivers. The Trump administration, though, is a bit more hardline when it comes to Iran, actually considerably more hardline when it comes to Iran. So early next year, when we take another look at the sanctions regime and who's still importing oil, I can't give you a firm answer on whether or not there will be multiple passes given. If there's heavy reduction once again, I think that the intent is pretty clear that we don't want to sever the relationship with India based on this if we can avoid it at all costs. But we've got some pretty hardline folks in the White House right now, so I can't tell you. So early next year we'll be facing this again.
But does the US appreciate the fact that the other sources of supply, if we were to cut off theoretically all the oil supply from Iran, the other sources may not be enough to make up the gap?
May not be, but there is enough global oil supply. But as you know, it's supply and demand. So as more countries look to places other than Iran, the prices go up. So I do think the administration has an appreciation about what this means, but they think that the threat that Iran poses to the rest of the world is grave enough where this is a point that they want to use to try to drive the Iran regime into changing sort of the outlook and policy, support of terrorism, support of regional insurgencies, things like that. So pain point for sure. I think there is a recognition, but they think that it's worth it based on hopefully trying to change the outlook and direction of the regime.
Does the US appreciate the fact that India is trying to build access to Afghanistan through Iran and we have fairly ambitious plans in Chabahar? Are they okay with that?
Yeah. Now, of course, there is no U.S., right? Different people are going to have different perspectives on this, but by and large, I mean, you saw even after the Iran waiver was given to India, there was further subsequent announcement that we were comfortable with India's development at Chabahar port. If you were to speak to, I think, senior officials in the U.S. military and foreign service establishment, I think that linkage is quite clear and quite critical for the United States. we don't ourselves have clear direction on our long-term plans for Afghanistan, but that's always a big debate too, right? Do you want to indicate what your long-term plans are and let the enemy know what you're thinking, or do you want to keep that held in reserve and surprise everybody as you announce different steps, whether to increase strength in Afghanistan or reduce? So we don't know, certainly those of us that are just outside government even, what the U.S. long-term strategy is. But there is a recognition that India is going to be a critical partner for Afghanistan's long-term stable development, and Chabahar Report's critical for that. So I think by and large, across the U.S., there's wide appreciation of the great role that India has played and will continue to play.
Since we are on the subject of Afghanistan, what are the areas of convergence and divergence here?
Well, I think we've taken two very different roles in terms of how India and the United States have approached Afghanistan. The United States, of course, with overt military support. India has been one of the most important development partners. The United States plays in that space a bit too. So, by and large, both of us have, I think, mostly the same goals in Afghanistan. I don't see so much of a divergence there. The bigger issue, of course, has always been our approach to Pakistan in dealing with Afghanistan. The United States has by and large felt that we need to try to engage Pakistan, that ultimately Pakistan holds at least as many keys to Afghan's long-term stability as anything resident in Afghanistan itself. India less comfortable with U.S. talks with Pakistan, especially since that results in at least a light era of bonhomie between the United States and Pakistan. I think the United States, though, under the Trump administration, is much more tired of trying to hopefully change the way that Pakistan approaches Afghanistan. And so even that one area where you did see a bit of abrasion between our different approaches between India and the United States in terms of the role that we see in Pakistan in this mix, I think that's coming together in a bigger way than we've seen in previous governments as well. So I think by and large, our approaches are very similar. The tools that we employ there, though, with the United States having more of a military front approach, are a little bit different. The bigger issue, though, of course, is consultations. We need to make sure, the U.S. government needs to make sure that we are bringing your government in the loop in terms of what our thinking and planning is, so that we can take your ideas and recommendations on board as well. I fear that our consultation process, sometimes we announce our decisions to India and to the world, rather than involving our critical partners like India as we try to formulate those decisions.
In your own country, Mr. Rosso, in the Trump administration, what is it that you're hearing about the way the conflict in Afghanistan is going? Is it pessimistic? I mean, we hear reports that the war is more or less lost.
Well, I don't know that people are talking openly about lost. We have obviously in some factors like casualty reports and such. It's not as I think as horrific as what we were hearing a few years before. But at the same time, the ability to generate real momentum and wider blankets of security across have been very, very difficult. Slow process, and every time you take 2 steps forward, you take 1 or 2 steps backward, sometimes even 3 steps. So I don't know that the United States has yet figured out, if you look 5 years and 10 years out, what our approach to Afghanistan and what the net result is going to look at in that period. I think it's a period of real introspection right now. And again, I do hope that we take our partners' views on board as we try to figure out what our next steps are going to be. Because right now, I just don't feel that we've got a firm plan. And I think we need to get in that direction. Not that, of course, every plan falls apart as soon as you begin to try to initiate it in a place that is, rife with instability. But right now, it just feels like we put it in park, and we're kind of hoping that maybe a decision lands on our desk. Maybe a good idea lands on the desk rather than aggressively trying to approach one. So not quite as bad of a situation as it has been in times past, but certainly nobody thinks that they've got an honest appraisal that there's an easy way forward that's going to result in a stable Afghanistan. So engagement with partners is going to be really important at this point.
So, does the U.S. at any point would like Indian troops on the ground in Afghanistan? Is this something which has been conveyed? I understand it has.
Well, I mean, Trump had this. The Trump administration has asked India to play a bigger role. They haven't formally announced, what specifically that means. You had this interesting remark when Secretary of State Tillerson, former Secretary of State Tillerson, came to my institution, CSIS, and gave that speech on the free and open Indo Pacific. and at that time had mentioned that India's trade surplus with the United States should be repurposed to strengthen stability in Afghanistan, which I found to be a puzzling remark. I'm not sure exactly the connection between what private sector entities do to generate a trade surplus and how that should translate into military support or economic support for another country. I think the United States wants India to step up and to do more. They haven't openly articulated what exactly that means. India at the initial invasion of Afghanistan had been willing to talk about a real military commitment at the time, but the United States did not want to see it at that time. And you can imagine in a place where Pakistan supports irregular militia, Indian troops would be targets number 1, 2, and 3 in that kind of a scenario. So I think if we were to formally make that request, and I've heard rumors that it's different kinds of military partnership have been broached, but whether it's troops on the ground hasn't been clear to me. Taking that kind of step would clearly signal that all bets are off, that we've given up completely on Pakistan. But that's a difficult pill to swallow because Pakistan, although for all the wrong reasons, is so heavily engaged with what's happening in Afghanistan. So more support from India for stability in Afghanistan, sure. Troop support on the ground, I've not heard that brought up directly. Some broader form of military support, sure. And we've seen the transfer of attack helicopters and some other things that I think India would be willing to do.
The sense here is that Mr. Trump began well as far as Pakistan is concerned, but at some point he seems to have lost interest, or things don't seem to be going forward the way India would like it. Is that your perception?
No, I think a lot of the things that India has been calling for, particularly for the United States to withdraw military financial support for Pakistan, is there. Military financial support is practically down to zero, though surprisingly, Pakistan hasn't cut off our lines of communication to Afghanistan. So, by and large, it's in some ways the exact scenario that I think India would have hoped for. No support for Pakistan, but at the same time, the United States still retains that ability to influence events in Afghanistan. The big question right now that I think looms over the United States' head, and something that I think India wants very much, as we talk about Pakistan approaching the IMF for another bailout of its horrible financial situation, and the question is IMF bailout money going to be used to pay off some of the support that China's given for the China-Pakistan economic corridor? Will the United States put a firm line down and say that any bailout program should not be attuned to something that's part of the China-run Belt and Road scenario, One Belt, One Road program? So I think we have another proof point that's not far down the road right now as we look at our different approaches to a potential IMF bailout of Pakistan and its linkages in particular to the programs that China's funding, which I think your government rightly considers to be a direct connection with Guadar Port with potential military implications there. So I think we do have another proof point around the corner, but so far so good. I think the United States has largely taken the steps that your country would have wanted. But again, there will be other opportunities down the line to show exactly where the U.S. position is on Pakistan.
I want to ask you a question on the Quad. What's the future of the Quad?
I don't know. That's a great question. So far, we've had a few meetings at the assistant secretary or joint secretary level, but there aren't yet crystallized plans on what missions the Quad would plan to do. Missions, even in the sense of, the United States had pushed for Australia's inclusion in the annual Malabar exercise, right? That would have been one of the first visible proof points that the Quad is a real thing coming into existence. But so far, the Indian government in particular is not yet ready to take that step. So in terms of quantifiable, tangible next steps, we don't know. There's another meeting taking place. They expect that it's probably going to meet a couple of times a year at this level and let things play out as they do. I know that it is critical to keep that alive and to try to figure out some specific things, because in my own engagements with the Chinese government, the Quad is the thing that seems to concern them the most in terms of a rising security establishment in the region that could potentially put a counterforce for when China takes aggressive measures and tries to rewrite the existing rules for Asian security. So the Quad clearly bothers the one country that I think so far is trying to rewrite the rules, but it's not an actual entity in the sense that it conducts particular missions or has a particular role in the world yet. So it's still waiting to evolve. And there's so many players out there that difficult to see exactly the common space everybody's going to agree to on it. So Quad important as a signaling measure, but in practice still yet to be determined.
The last question regarding Indo-Pacific. How committed is the US towards, the whole business of containing China? I mean, the trade sanctions they enforced on China appear to be working, but how far is the US willing to go?
Well, it seems the Trump administration is willing to go quite far. You actually heard him giving a speech to U.S. farm groups because China, as part of the trade war with China, has initiated retaliatory tariffs, particularly targeting agriculture products, among other groups. And President Trump speaking to agriculture groups and saying that there's going to be a bit of pain that we all have to swallow. It's a lot more difficult to swallow that pain in democracy than it is in a dictatorship like China has, especially one where the leader has now written themselves into power for life. So, in some ways, China has more ability to bear the burden politically. But on the other hand, the United States to China is a far more important economic entity than China is to the United States. Clearly, China is a really big deal to the United States. But in as much as the United States, both as a market, but also as a director of international markets, it's really important. So, when we talk about containment of China, I always like to stress too that it's only containment of aggressive actions that are trying to destabilize the region. There's so many ways that China has actually been a good player outside of its own borders. They were a rock of support during the global financial crisis and things like this. Even some of the things that they do in development activities across Africa and other parts of the world. But we do want to contain the aggressive behaviors that are destabilizing the region there. And I think the Trump administration is quite committed to the view that China has actually leveraged these massive trade surpluses and all the investment that helped to make that possible to help fund and fuel its military ambitions and the Belt and Road, which we know has got ulterior motives.
Yeah.
So when you think about the connections between China's dominance in the global economic markets and what it's doing recently in the military, I think the Trump administration looks at those things as more closely intertwined than any previous administration that I've seen. So I think they're willing to keep this up for quite some time.
Mr. Rosso, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.